that ran in the summer of 1866. It was published in Utah and California, and it was written to dissuade women from coming to Washington to try to be a clerk. It really over-exaggerated things, but it is true that it wasn't an easy life, necessarily. And so I was going to try to talk about 3 things, but I think when I was practicing, I was running out of space. And the rumors of sexual immorality is the most salacious aspect of my talk, and I figure we all need a little salaciousness at 9 in the morning on a Saturday in a library. So I'm going to skip through the first part, which is that. So let me just tell you what women did so you have an idea of what I'm talking about. Huge range of work. So as I said before, supervisors really kind of had control over what they did in their own departments. The work of clerks even was largely undifferentiated. So as we were learning about Walt Whitman yesterday, you could be doing rote copy work, and then you could also be doing what they called head work, which was, writing letters and making your own policy decisions, kind of, that would later be approved. So women also fell into this, that they could be put kind of on anything. But in the Department of Agriculture, for example, women were hired to sow seeds into bags that they would then distribute across the country. But women were also hired, for example, Lois Bryan Adams, who had been an editor of a agricultural periodical in Michigan, was hired to run the museum under Isaac Newton. Not that Isaac Newton, he was the head of the Department of Agriculture, but in the War Department, about 28 to 31 women were hired to be copyists in the Quartermaster's Department. Women also worked in the arsenal, and I don't have time to go into this, but in June 1864 there was an explosion that killed 21 of them, and they're buried at the Congressional Cemetery, which I understand we're going to hear more about later. Women worked in the post office. They worked at the dead letter office, redirecting wayward mail. There was a woman who also translated all of the international correspondence from Spain, France, and Germany, I believe. And in the Treasury Department, that's where women had the most opportunity for a variety of work, because there was so much work to be done there. I like the alliteration here, but women did counting, cutting, copying, and counterfeit detecting, among other things. So, for example, this is a wood cutting. This is women in the printing room of the Treasury building. I don't know if you can see very well, but this is a woman on the printing press. This is a man working next to her, so you can see that this is a mixed-sex workspace. Not only are they in the same room, but they're on the same machine, literally. Women would take damp sheets and put it in between the printing press, and the man would then slam it down to print the money. This is where they were cutting greenbacks. So women entered really where they came in, sort of en masse, was through the cutting room doors. F.E. Spinner had been the Treasury Secretary, and he walked into a room one day in the early 1860s, and men were cutting notes. They would be printed in sheets, and you had to cut them out. He sees men doing this, he's horrified. He said they should be shouldering muskets instead of shears. Women can do this work. So he pulled in Jenny Douglas, who had been his daughter's teacher. Her school had gone under. She did, allegedly, twice the work, and she was willing to do it for half the pay. So that decided the matter, and women came in. This work then became mechanized. So these women are using machines to cut the Treasury. They had initially used scissors. This is counting worn money and defaced currency. So one of the big jobs of women in the Treasury was counting money. And imagine counting money for 7 hours a day. And if you made a mistake, it came out of your check, which, as we'll see, was already small to begin with. So women became very good at detecting counterfeit money, counting money, and also redeeming mutilated currency. So for example, and this is an actual example, your trunk of money sinks in the Mississippi and lies there for a few months, moldering and rotting and becoming destroyed, but you want to get that money back. You take it to the Treasury. This group of women would then take it apart with tweezers and try to actually verify that the money that you had in the trunk is actually what you had. They became very good at this, and in the Chicago Fire of 1871, money was sent to the women of the Treasury Department to redeem and make sure that it was the right amount of money. This is the post office, the dead letter office that I told you about. So here's another mixed-sex workspace. These are men down here. They are redirecting dead letters, and the women work up here, around here, redirecting wayward letters. So all over the country, if a letter couldn't be sent, so for example, it was addressed to John in America, it wound up at the post office in the dead letter office, and they would try to either get it to the intended recipient or to the person that had sent it. People would also send things like live turtles, and they'd write address on the back. So these women had to deal with things like live turtles and severed fingers and horrible things that people would send around. It all came through the dead letter office. The men down here, they did the exact same work as the women up here. With one exception, the men were allowed to open the mail. So the women were not allowed to open the mail for fear that it would contain something scandalous and absolutely shock them. So the men had to do this. They also redirected letters. The men, as we'll see, earned between $1,200 to $1,800 a year for doing this. The women earned half, exact same job. So let's talk about pay. So Lucy Everett applied for a job at the War Department in October 1864. Her father had been taken prisoner. She hadn't heard from him since May, and they were starting to get really worried. There was no income coming into the house. She applied to the War Department. She didn't get the job at the War Department. It was actually, and I would have talked about this earlier, it was actually very hard to get a job with the federal government. I've been through and categorized 177 application files, and only 45 of them, or about 25%, were successful, and I think that's actually a high number. Department heads talk about getting 20 applications for every place they had to fill. She did get a job in the Treasury, though, and in 1866, she was one of 59 women who signed a petition for increased pay. So let me tell you about what clerks were paid in the 1860s. So throughout the 1860s, male clerks, including Walt Whitman, claimed to be underpaid. Congress set the pay scale for clerks before the Civil War. So they were set at $1,200, $1,400, $1,600, and $1,800 a year, classes 1 through 4. They didn't change that during the Civil War, and men were constantly agitating that this was just not sufficient to support them. They came up with all kinds of schemes to kind of make the most of their dollars. They looked into all moving to Baltimore and working with the Baltimore Railroad to get a commuter rate. They looked at buying coal cooperatively. They asked the government to provide them with subsidized housing. So remember, women are earning half. They're also supporting families. So they don't like this pay scale either. When women joined, they were all paid $600 a year maximum. Female laborers were paid even less. They paid about $216 a year. So in 1865, they agitated, and Congress raised their pay to $720 a year. But then the women of the Treasury in 1866 come together and say, this isn't fair. The quote from the petition is that they inform the congressman that there is a vast disproportion existing between the salaries of the male and female clerks of this department. While we do not grudge our male friends one iota of the success which falls to their share, yet when they, by whose side we sit day after day, whose labors and duties are identical with our own, and whose home responsibilities in most instances are not so great, whose salaries commence with $1,200 per annum, when they are promoted from first to second and from second to third, the question forces itself upon us, what makes us to differ from them? So, this was not the only petition from women asking for more money in the 1860s. This was actually one of, I think, 8 so far that I've found of women agitating to get their salaries increased. I've also found yesterday, or the day before, a petition from the female sweepers and scrubbers, women who were illiterate and couldn't even sign their names but made their marks next to a thing that said, we deserve to earn more money than we're earning. They had some minor success. So in the General Appropriation Bill of 1866, women got their salaries raised to $900 a year. But that wasn't what they were really asking for. In 1867, all the clerks, men, including Walt Whitman, who signed his name to a petition, or helped write the petition on behalf of the Attorney General, asked for a 20% pay increase because of cost of living. The whole thing snagged on whether women would get the extra 20%. In the bill, it said that if you had received a raise within the year, you weren't going to get it. Women had gotten bumped up to $900 a year. So Congress said, well, they shouldn't be in it. And then other congressmen said, this is entirely unfair. Why are we paying them half of what men get paid to do the same work? So there was a huge, full-throated, totally precocious debate about equal pay in the 1860s. There were 4 debates from 1867 to 1870, 3 in the Senate and 1 in the House. And they had a real kind of shockingly candid discussion about why we should pay women half of what we pay men to do the same job. Now, paying women less than men wasn't a new thing. Women had been underpaid since they entered wage labor. The thing here, though, was 1, they were doing the exact same job, and 2, to get a raise, you had to petition Congress. So you had to have this national discussion. The arguments for equal pay were, straightforward. It was, this is equal justice. It's just makes common sense. The men advocating for equal pay couldn't even understand how you could argue against them. The men leading the charge were radical Republicans like Trumbull or Pomeroy, but strangely, there were also former supporters of slavery in there who made comments that are really hard to understand, like, well, if we hire one person with 2 hands and 1 head to do work, why would we pay them different from another person with 2 hands and 1 head? They also agitated for equal pay. The arguments against equal pay, one was that it was a different conception of what the government should be. So the people against equal pay were saying, we're hiring people, we're acting like a business. It doesn't make sense for us to pay people more than they're willing to take for doing the job, and we have people clamoring for these jobs. So we shouldn't spend money out of the national coffers to hire these women if they'll do it for half. The men arguing against that had a very different conception of what government should be, and they said it should set an example for the nation. And I think we're all familiar with that quote in the context of African Americans. Men voting against equal pay also argued that if they were to do that, then voting enfranchised men would take the jobs of these women because they had more power, and so we should kind of keep women underpaid and powerless. Both houses passed legislation saying there should be equal pay. So this was the prevailing idea in both houses, but unfortunately they both failed in committee. And in the congressional debates, people are very confused about how this happened. They say, we passed this by a decided majority, why did this not work? So in 1870, they came together for the last debate in the Senate, and it was not passed that they would equalize pay with men. It was passed that they would be able to elevate women to the ranks of first, second, third, fourth class clerkships. Unfortunately, it didn't happen because if you're a supervisor and a woman will do it for $600 a year, there's really no reason for you to pay her $1,200 a year. So women rose, but very, very slowly. One man, Democratic Representative Rogers of Arkansas, during the debates said, why are we even talking about this? We shouldn't be employing women at all, and implied that they were prostitutes. So, why did he think women were prostitutes? Well, in 1864, Samuel Chase, who was Secretary of the Treasury, hired investigator Lafayette C. Baker, a shady, kind of nefarious character, to investigate the Treasury Department. We had brought printing of the money in-house. We used to do it with banknote companies in New York. Now we brought it in-house, basically because this man, S.M. Clark, decided this would be a good idea. And there were rampant rumors of counterfeiting and fraud in the Treasury. This was problematic because we'd gone off the gold standard, so faith in the country meant faith in the currency, and if you didn't have faith that the money was being printed right, you started to lose faith in the currency. So I also think because Chase wanted to be the Republican nominee for president in 1864, he wanted this whole thing whitewashed, everything was okay. Baker did find fraud, though. He found counterfeiting and fraud. He arrested one guy whose last name was Wynn because he was the guy that had created this membrane paper that was supposed to be counterfeit-proof, but he thought the whole thing was a big scam, so he arrested him. Wynn sued Baker. Baker asked for protection from the Treasury Department, and they basically said, you're on your own. So Baker said, well, if I'm on my own, then I'm going to tell all kinds of things I found in my investigation, and then they kind of called his bluff. And then this happened. So this woman, Maggie Duval, died after a lingering illness which she bore with great resignation, according to her obituary. Baker didn't think that's what happened, and he stopped her funeral train on the way to her father's house where she was going to be buried, removed her body, and performed an autopsy in her father's house after removing her hysterical sister from the room. He thought she died of a botched abortion because she had been sleeping with her male supervisors. This is the autopsy. So what had happened was he thought that there were immoral things going on in the Treasury Department. One woman named Ella Jackson lived with another woman named Ada Thompson, who was an actress. He befriended Ada Thompson. The two of them broke into Ella Jackson's room, stole her diary, all her letters. When she came home, they confronted her, said, if you don't confess, we're going to send you to the old Capitol prison where you'll die. She confessed. I should say none of this is provable. Baker was very shady, and it's not really clear what's true and what's not in this entire scandal, but this is what was in the Congressional Investigation Report in 1864. Baker also got the confessions of other women, including Jenny Gurman, who claimed that she had been having sex with Clark in his home. Clark was the guy in charge of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. Having sex with Clark in his home, in his marital bed, while his wife was away, and that Clark was giving her extra money to do this. Duval's friend, Ella Jackson, was charged with conspiring to have her have this abortion that she allegedly died of, and so she was arrested as well. These are some of the other newspaper articles about the case. As it turns out, the autopsy discovered that she had not died of an abortion. She had died of the pulmonary illness that had claimed her life, as her physician who had been attending to her for weeks and weeks said. They actually discussed the condition of her uterus in the newspapers, which has been horrifying for her family. They said it was pure white. There was no way that she had had any of these immoralities. The upshot, however, was that in the congressional investigation in 1864, they concluded, somewhat illogically, that the women were guilty of being prostitutes, but the men were not guilty of having sex with them. It didn't really make sense, but I believe it was to safeguard the currency of the United States. Interestingly, James Garfield, who would later be our president, wrote the majority report of that congressional investigation. this might be Laura Duvall. So a couple weeks ago, I went to an archive in Indiana. I don't know if any of you read the book, The Dark Union by Neff. He discusses Baker in a different context. Laura Duvall allegedly befriended Baker after the entire investigation, which just adds to the confusion because he destroyed their lives. So it makes you sort of think that maybe they were kind of in cahoots here. I found her picture with the name Laura Duvall written on the back in his archives. I wanted to ask him about it, but unfortunately he died 3 days before I got there. So I don't know where he found this picture, and I don't have any way to verify it's actually Laura Duvall, but it was an old picture with her name written on the back, so I'm hoping that it was her. Even if we don't know if this is true, so even if we don't know if these women actually were having sex with these men, the bottom line is that it destroyed the reputation of women in the Treasury for years. I mean, even in the Wilson administration, during the trial of prostitutes, she said, well, we all know I don't run the best whorehouse in the city, that's the job of the Treasury Department. So women's reputations were just sullied, period. They would use the word Treasury clerk as a slur for prostitute. So women really had to fight against not only being underpaid, but having to constantly kind of defend their reputations against these allegations. A little bit of trivia that I will leave you with. This is S.M. Clark. He, in 1866, so just 2 years after this all went down, and he was clearly guilty of something, he put his own face on the 5-cent fractional currency note. There was an article in a war of letters to the editor in the New York Times over this, and there was an anonymous letter claiming that he didn't put himself on here, that the engravers just loved him so much that they wanted to engrave his face and put it on here. I think it's pretty clear he did it himself. So Congress passed a law that said you can't have living people on postage coins or currency. I think they're changing that for postage now, but so Clark is why. This is the reason. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to it.